when I come into a relationship with a plant, it's very much like going to a party. And you walk into the party and you cannot honestly tell me that you will have the same type and level of conversation with your best friend as you do with your boss. You will be two completely different people. And plants, don't forget, they're millions of years older than us. So they will have conversations with us based on our experience, based on where our emotional and mental health are. You can't, I've got a monkshood in my garden that gives me really lovely vibes, but just refuses to talk to me. And you've got to understand that there will be certain plants that just don't want to talk to you. They are people. They have the right to say, nah, piss off. I don't really want to talk to you. I don't want to talk to humans. Blackthorn, one of my major teachers, Blackthorn, she's a really difficult tree to get to know. She don't want to talk to you. It takes a lot of work to get to know a blackthorn. But other people's experiences will be very different from your own. And in our culture, difference tends to be thought as wrong. But in this circumstance, difference is perfect, because that validity of that relationship is they're working directly with what you need and what you want to understand, not what somebody else down the road that's doing the same work as you will do. So it's about, again, those doubt devils, about casting those aside and accepting what the plant is trying to teach you.
Welcome to Coffee and Divination, a podcast about the arts of obtaining hidden knowledge in changing times. Join me, JoAnna Farrar, to chat with experts from around the world on tarot, runes, geomancy, and the many ways divination can help us navigate and plan our paths ahead. I'm delighted to share today's conversation with Sian Sibley, an author whose work brings together some very important threads in plant magic, geomancy, animism, witchcraft, and a deep reverence for the living places where we actually are. Sian has been a writer and witch and educator for over 30 years. She's also a biological scientist and teacher by trade, and she weaves together so many of those threads beautifully in her works. In this interview, we talk about her latest book, Black Paths and Green Cathedrals, and explore what it means to build relationships with plants and spirits in our everyday practice. Before we dive in, I also just want to take a moment to say that this is the last weekend before my first book, The Diviner's Path, officially comes out from Llewellyn on June 8th. Pre-orders and early orders really do make a difference for authors, and I'm very grateful to everyone who's already ordered the book and talked about it with others. If you haven't already ordered and you're curious, the links are all in the show notes. I also have a number of different in-person events coming up. I will be presenting a workshop at the famous Atlantis Bookshop in London in July. I'll be at the Serpent's Key in Pennsylvania in August, and a number of other events in Vermont and New York in September. And of course, I will also be a presenter at Templefest this year, so if you haven't signed up for Templefest, I highly recommend you do. It's going to be a great time. All of this and a lot more is over on my website, where I've also added a lot of new free resources because of the book, which you can find there. And you can always keep up on what's going on and who's going to be on the shows coming up on our Instagram at Coffee and Divination. If this podcast is helpful to you, it really helps to share it with others and, of course, to review it if you can, wherever you listen to it. And thank you so much to everyone who has been so supportive of the podcast over the years. I'm very happy to welcome Sian Sibley. Well, it is my absolute pleasure to welcome onto the show Sian Sibley, someone whose works I have very much enjoyed and whose conversation already, even before we began recording, we were already enjoying our conversation on paganism and ecology and many other such things. So thank you so much for coming on the show.
Oh, it's wonderful to be here. Thank you for having me.
So we have a traditional first question. And the first question is, since this is a podcast about divination, I'm curious to know, what was your first encounter with divination or things that are related to that? Was there somebody in your family who practiced, magic or divination or read tea leaves or something? Or was this something you encountered and started reading cards or something when you were much, much older?
It's a weird start for me, because nobody in my family was in any way pagan or associated with witchcraft. In fact, it was the opposite. On my father's side, all of the men in my father's line are Pentecostal ministers. So they were very, very religious. So, but then on my mother's side, they were all atheist. And it's very weird. I always say this. I think that my grandmother came from a family of pagans that were hidden pagans, because in a time when everybody named their children with biblical names, my great aunts and uncles, my grandmother's brothers and sisters, were called things like Harvest and Merlin and Iris, which is a flower, and Iris, which is, they weren't biblical names at all. They were all Welsh and folklore names or mythological names. I can honestly say that divination for me was something that it came very naturally from sort of gut feeling and that sort of stuff. But I didn't use a set of cards until I started learning tarot when I was probably about 26 or 27. And now what I have now is, over the last probably 12 years, as I've been working with the spirits of the trees and the plants, every time I work with a new spirit, or my husband actually, because he's a really good artist, makes me a meditational card. So I've ended up with a pack of probably around 80 cards. And like, I'll have things like, for me, a butterfly is about transformation. So he's drawn me a butterfly. And so I use those now as divination cards. But as a coven, we use lots and lots of different methods. Geomancy, particularly, we really like as a coven, because you can use it magically as well for divination. So, yeah, we have a big tradition of, and it's really weird because our initiate study at the moment is talking about tarot for divination, but for magical purposes and for meditational purposes as well. So we got a big project going on as a group on improving our divination. So it's a good timing for this podcast.
Oh, fantastic. Yeah, no, I'm sure we will get into geomancy and connections with, how you have it in your book, your most recent book. So you mentioned your background was from that decidedly, at least not openly, or would not be called pagan, shall we say. How did this kind of connection to land spirits and the work that you do now develop for you?
It started when I was very young. We had ponies and horses, and very often my background was, how can I put this? I had a wonderful family, but my mother and father weren't particularly happy with the life they had, and they tended to be very argumentative, and there was quite a lot of alcohol and those types of things involved as well. So I spent a lot of time with my brothers and sisters. I've got 2 sisters and a brother, and we took our ponies out into the land. And what I found is that I would speak naturally to my pony, to the trees as I was walking through, and that connection was there. But then when I was about 11 or 12, I came into the local library. Now in Wales, we have free libraries, but they are very, very, how can I put it, white bread. Okay, so you very rarely get anything on witchcraft. And at the time, I didn't know I was practicing witchcraft, okay, because I was doing magic quite naturally without knowing what it was. And I went into the library one day, and on the table, not on the shelf, on the table, was a copy of What Witches Do by Janet Farrar and Stuart Farrar. Now, in Tonnereville, remembering that my grandfather was the Pentecostal preacher at the time, I knew that if I had taken out that book as a loan, they would have told my grandfather. So I stole it. I put it into my pocket and snuck out. This was when I was 11, and I've still got the book today. And that, although I didn't understand the pictures because I was only 11 and I didn't understand the ritual per se, when they were talking about magic and that relationship with the divine being in nature, that spoke to me. And from then on, I always thought of myself as not being Christian, which was really different in those days because we're talking about the 1970s, and spending most of my time out in the country. So it's been a very, very, very long journey. So we're talking 50 years ago now. So it's a long time.
Yeah, no, that's amazing. When you mentioned that, I looked over at my copy of What Witches Do, which I did not steal from the library, but I definitely understand that whole if you find that book, because I had the same thing when I was a kid, that there's just randomly a book in the library. Libraries are
That's
magical places for a reason. So
massively so. But you know, the thing that absolutely has made my year is that I run conferences in Britain, and I invited Janet Farrar and Gavin Bone to speak at one of the conferences, and they came. And my publisher had sent out, as they do, as you know, my new book, which was coming out because she thought she would be a good person to review, and she loved my book. So I was so chuffed. It's sort of come full circle. It's been a lovely experience.
oh, that is really beautiful. Yeah, that's wonderful. So, with that being said, we the your latest book is titled like Black Paths and Green Cathedrals, and you write a lot about the intersection of ecology and paganism and animism and all of that. Could you maybe tell us a little bit of what Black Paths and Green Cathedrals is about for people who may not have read it yet, just so that we get that intro taste before we dive in?
Black Paths and Green Cathedrals is a reference to where I live to start off with, because where I live, there are a tremendous amount of coal seams and coal mines, old coal mines. So the coal dust goes into the soil, and the soil is very rich and it's very full of coal. Okay. And then the Green Cathedrals in Wales, we have the most amazing forestry, and whether it be farmed forest or whether it be wild forest, the most beautiful trees, one of which is a yew tree that I work with, which is, they believe, they can't age it properly, but they believe it's between 4,000 and 5,000 years old, which is an amazing age. And he lives in a churchyard up in Llanfaglan, which is up in the Brecon Beacons, which is wonderful. If ever you get to come to Wales, go and see Llanfaglan. It's gorgeous. But for me, it came from a place where I've been running a coven for a long, long time. And I started working with plant spirits when through the alchemical texts of Charabel, okay, who is a Welsh, what I would call a shaman, really, because he's working with plant spirits. And I suddenly realized that one of the things that I was doing as a pagan was I wasn't acknowledging the personhood of the plants that I was using for things like incense. And that to me was, if I'm claiming to be an animist, then I've got to acknowledge the personhood of the things or the people that I'm using or working with. So I started working with the Charabel method, and my first plant was Mugwort. And I don't know whether you work with Mugwort, but she is a wonderful plant to start off with. She is very welcoming and very loving and very open to bridge between you and other plants as well. I find that smoking Mugwort in my pipe when I'm working with other plants really eases that communication between you and the plants. But then as I looked into it more, I looked at the different things that we do as pagans, for example, crystal use. And the majority of pagans that you speak to are beautiful, ecologically sound. Most of them are vegetarian. A lot of them are driving ecologically friendly cars. They are doing their recycling. And yet we're still using crystals. And if you look into where crystals come from, they are mined in exactly the same way as your tin, your copper, your coal. They're all deep mined, or they're shallow mined in strip mining, okay? The other bit that concerned me was that the way that they are gathered is that children are used in the labour to get them from the ground, because they're pickers. They pick from the surface if they're surface mines. So I decided that I would do a survey and talk to different people about why they used crystals. And the majority of people that have, and I mean a tremendous amount of crystals, don't actually use them at all. They just they stand on the altar as decorative pieces. Well, if you're an animist, I don't see how you can calibrate taking something from, for example, Argentina, where most of your amethyst comes from, shipping it right across the water, and then put it on a shelf and not work with it, because you have no relationship with that amethyst person. If you believe it's an animist society, you're better off walking out into the wood locally and finding a stone. because that will give you a more immediate relationship with the land around you, rather than A, being unecological and shipping it across the sea, B, mining, and C, those stones don't know us, we don't know them. So pulling them out of the ground to enhance your own spirituality is a little bit false.
The crystal issue is one that is almost like a symbolic step in the right direction of when we examine one thing, we find that then it brings up a lot of other connections that we may have been unaware of. There are certainly limits to how much that we can perfect that relationality, because there's always going to be issues in any system. But if we start to think in one direction with like crystals, for an example, then it'll probably bring up other things that could be changed. And we already, before we began recording, brought up frankincense, and I feel like frankincense is such an important thing. I love the scent of frankincense, and I do have a small amount of it that I use on special occasions, but it is, in my opinion, meant to be used very sparingly. And there's lots of other things we could substitute. Could you maybe talk a little bit about frankincense before we go?
Yes. Well, when I started looking at animist relationships and the relationships between pagans and the products that they use, I did some investigation into incenses. And what I found was the boswellia tree, which is where the frankincense resin comes from, is grown in parts of Africa. And as well as being affected by climate change now, it's something that, you know, when you start reading it and you start thinking about it, you just think, oh yeah, I didn't think about that. What happened was, when frankincense has been used for millennia, okay, it was used in Egyptian temples, it's been used in Mesopotamia, it's always been used for religious offering and for ritual performance. But what's happened over the last 2,000 years, the majority of people who used frankincense were Catholic churches. But in a Catholic society, there would be sort of one church per town. And they would use quite a bit, but it would be once a week when they did mass. But now, if you look at the latest census of both UK and in America, there are nearly 500,000 of us now. When you look at the census, well, every single person has about 10 grams of frankincense. So that's a hell of a lot more than is currently being used by the Catholic Church. So it's not about people being careless or being malicious when they're buying these things. It's purely a numbers game, because there are more of us. And I thank whatever divinity you believe in for that, because I think green religions, particularly paganism, are the way forward in the ecological societies that we're in now to solve the problems that we're having. But we have to take account of the fact that when something becomes fashionable and popular, we then use lots of it. You know, it is a problem purely because of numbers.
Yeah. And that also speaks to the other really key element that I'm very certain that you and I agree on, which is that location matters and that localness matters. So if you are talking about either, you know, picking up a stone that you are near because it's where you live or where you find yourself, that's very different from the extractive process of having something shipped across the world.
Absolutely.
Related to that, then, since this is a podcast about divination, I think that one of the most fascinating parts to that, and I have had people ask me this, I think, and you answer it in many different ways in your book. When people say, well, okay, I want to form a relationship with the spirits around me, how do I know that I'm not talking to myself or just imagining things in my head? How do you think with helping people if they are new to that process of discernment and listening?
Well, I call them the doubt devils, okay? And everybody struggles with it, okay? The only people that don't struggle with doubt devils are people who are evangelical. And we don't want to encourage that in any religion, okay? Because you will always doubt what you're getting, because unless your ego is so big that you don't, okay? So what I always say is, I think I list 4 things in the book. One is, does it enhance your own spirituality? Does it make you feel elevated? Does it make you feel more than you were before you started the divinatory or the spirit process? If the answer is yes, keep going. That's fine. Are the spirits, or are you getting divinations that are asking you in any way to manipulate or to use something you shouldn't be, or talk to somebody in a way that you shouldn't be? If they are, stop and try again. Thirdly, if it's something that you need proof of, then you're never going to get past that point where you are allowing those divinations to give you information, because part of the process of opening the divinatory centers, particularly when it comes to working with tarot or working with pendulum, is that you're actually, there's two ways of thinking about it. I think about it in that I'm working with the spirit of my pendulum, or I'm working with the spirit of the tarot. But in working with those spirits, you're also working with the higher aspects of yourself that are more open to group mind and to looking at the flow of ideas, okay? So when I'm doubting, what I'm doubting is both my relationship with the divinatory tool and my relationship with myself. But it's very easy to do. For me, I'm a trained scientist, so I had an enormous issue in the beginning when I was working with Mugwort. And a good friend of mine at the time said to me, right, he said, this is what you do. He said, you've got your symbol, you've got your doorway to work with the spirit, but you're struggling with believing that that's true, that you're not just inventing it. So he said, get the name that you've got from the plant, which for me was Amisrael, and plot it on a Kamea, which is, for me, I use the Venus Kamea because Mugwort is a Venus plant. And when I plotted those two, they were almost identical. And it was hysterically funny, and I think I've written about it in the book, when I ran out like a little girl to my garden and went, look, all excited, and what I got from the Mugwort was, no shit, Sherlock. So they do have patience, because one of the things that people don't realize, calling yourself a pagan, calling yourself a witch, calling yourself somebody who believes in spirits besides the human spirit, is overcoming probably around 1,000 years of indoctrination where the human is the highest person on that pyramid. So allowing you to understand that other people are alive, they just don't look like me and you, and they have very different biologies and very different ways of living in the world, that's a massive step. So you're inevitably going to have some sort of doubt devils floating around in your head. Because, and the other thing that we've got to get over as well is that for those 1,000 years where we've been told that the world is a mechanism, 300 years it got worse, okay? We had the ancient Greeks originally started with this golden chain of Homer, where we were in the, well, male intellectuals were in the middle, we weren't really mentioned. And then it carried on until you got to Descartes and all of the mechanist philosophers. And that then told us that even we were biological machines. We weren't really a person, we were just biological machines. And that's fed through to our medicine, to our philosophy, and to the way we treat the world. So getting over that, that's a massive thing for white Western people. We got a big jump, but we've got to get there, because if we don't get there, I would say in another 50 to 100 years, we're not going to be here to get there, okay? Because I'm a great believer in poo-pooing this idea that we are going to kill the earth. We won't kill the earth. We will do away with ourselves, and the earth will just go, let's try again. So it's the idea that we are the top of the pile. Is ego on a massive part, and it comes from the patriarchal religions, and I blame the ancient Greeks as well, because they were a pain in the bum with it. But it's also it's a safe place for us to be as a culture, because it means we are more important and we have a bigger say in how the world is. It's about control. That's all it's about, is control. So if we can get over that and you can release those doubt devils, it opens you up to so much more. You're literally never on your own, because wherever you go, there are plants. Wherever you go, there are spirits. So it sort of allows you to see the world as it actually is, instead of this veneer that we've put on it.
I completely agree. One of the things that I think when I was sort of a child, realizing that sort of animistic ways were not how other people saw things, it was very odd to kind of feel the isolation and the loneliness of when you don't include others with,
Yeah,
quote in the conversation, then yes, it is extremely isolating and lonely. And I think theoretically that does make people maybe possibly a little easier to control, because if you're afraid and alone, look at that. You're going to rely on externals
exactly.
in a different
But
way.
it's the control mechanism of the patriarchal churches if you think about it, it's a masterstroke of manipulation. It's amazing because one of the things that they do is if you are a person who believes in a heaven and a hell, particularly, and the people that are controlling the entry into heaven are telling you how to behave, okay? You will comply because you're too frightened not to. Whereas people like me that are pagan and see death as a completely natural and not even a sort of unusual thing, because absolutely everything in the real world dies without being frightened, without, the way you die causes fear. If you're hunted down by a lion and eaten, that's going to cause you fear. But it's not, the death isn't something that other creatures fear. So that introduction of heaven and hell, that is a masterstroke of manipulation by those religions. So, and it makes me smile because the very people who preach that this is how you should behave, don't behave in that way.
Hypocrisy. Hypocrisy haunts us all in some form or
Exactly.
another. So yes. So speaking of that, you were mentioning how, of course, Mugwort. I agree is a beautiful teacher who I'm so happy to have around me and so present for people both in
Oh,
the
yeah.
US and in the UK. So that is one. Your books frequently go into depth about individual plant spirits and how to connect with them, and they're based obviously on where you are in the UK, but many of those same species are found in other parts of Europe and the US. um, when you are building relationships with a given tree or an area of land, what are some of the ways that those places, like, what do they expect of us? How do you think of like what the expectations are from their?
That's a very good question. What I tend to do is the main way to build a relationship with anything is to give it time, to go and sit and just, and it's something we really struggle with, be quiet. Yeah, just sit and listen and feel. Yeah, I am not a person, I'm not particularly clairvoyant, I'm not particularly clairaudient. I feel things very much in my body, and the communication with plants and with land for me comes through the feelings it makes in my body. And they will then translate in my mind as to what the plant is thinking, what the plant is trying to give you. One of the things that I am very, very keen on is for people to steward. And when I say steward, I mean the proper use of the word steward, not the one you see in the Bible. Steward means to be in relationship with, to look after, to tend. And when you say things to the land like, if you will teach me about these plants, then I will tend to you, it means that you have to pick up the rubbish. It means that if somebody is using a technique of magic, for example, a clootie, which is environmentally damaging, that you go and you remove those clooties, even if you've got people there shouting at you, because those clooties are their magical practice. Well, I'm sorry, if your magical practice is killing the tree that you're using for magic, that's not magical practice. That's the only place I tend to get a little bit spiky, is when I have pagans that won't listen. So, for example, clootie stuff. If you're using a clootie, I don't know whether you're aware of clooties. You tie a rag around a tree and you infuse the rag with your spell, and as the rag rots, the spell is released into the world. Okay, but a lot of people now are misusing the technology in that they're using clooties that are non-biodegradable. So the magic is stuck there. So your spell won't work for a start, but also it cuts into the xylem of the tree where the water goes through, and it makes the tree infected. It causes the tree branch to die. So whenever I go anywhere, I take a little penknife with me, and when I see those things, I cut them off. You know, if it's made of paper or it's made of something like a hemp or something like that, I'll leave them there because that person knows what they're doing. But if it's florist ribbon or anything like that, I will take it off. Okay, so that service is about looking after that relationship with the land and the plants on that land. So that's why it's really important to make sure that when you're forming relationships, it's with land that's around you. Because if you commit to, for example, I work with a garden that's down in Sutherdown, which is about 20 minutes away from me. Well, that means every time I go down to that garden, I have to do some work. I have to pick up rubbish, or I have to, well, if I was doing that every day, that's 20 minutes a day. So it's a massive commitment if the land is not where you live. And there's a wonderful book by a lady called Lynn Shaw, who's talking about working with the plants and the land where you live, even if you live in a city, that you can find plant spirits. And one of the things she says in her book, which I loved, is the fact that because it's covered in concrete, we tend to ignore the land that's under a city, but it's still alive. It's still, working. It's just got a layer of concrete over it. It doesn't mean it's dead. It just means it's not flowering at the moment. But then when you look in the cracks of the pavement, there's always flowers and plants. So it's about giving that service. It's about, like, one of the things that I'm doing in May, on the 15th of May, I'm going down. We're having a big issue at the moment with sewage in our water. So I'm doing a speech to Surfers Against Sewage that are doing a paddle out to sort of raise awareness. And if I don't get lynched after giving this speech, I don't know what will happen, because it's very impassioned. I have sent it to the organizer and made sure it's okay, because I was a bit scared about people getting upset. But so that, that's part of my service. When my coven goes anywhere, we do pick up rubbish, we do take it. So it's service to the land in that way. So.
Yeah, and that is also where it is individual, because the kinds of expectations of service will necessarily be different based on what the real needs are. So that's that time of listening and not deciding, oh, well, I heard this person on a podcast say I should do
exactly
one thing.
Exactly. It's interesting for me, because one of the things that and I do try to make it clear in the book, is people worry about when their relationship with the plant or their experience with the plant doesn't match up to something that's in a book. And my argument is that it's when I come into a relationship with a plant, it's very much like going to a party. And you walk into the party and you cannot honestly tell me that you will have the same type and level of conversation with your best friend as you do with your boss. You will be two completely different people. And plants, don't forget, they're millions of years older than us. So they will have conversations with us based on our experience, based on where our emotional and mental health are. You can't, I've got a monkshood in my garden that gives me really lovely vibes, but just refuses to talk to me. And you've got to understand that there will be certain plants that just don't want to talk to you. They are people. They have the right to say, nah, piss off. I don't really want to talk to you. I don't want to talk to humans. Blackthorn, one of my major teachers, Blackthorn, she's a really difficult tree to get to know. She don't want to talk to you. It takes a lot of work to get to know a blackthorn. But other people's experiences will be very different from your own. And in our culture, difference tends to be thought as wrong. But in this circumstance, difference is perfect, because that validity of that relationship is they're working directly with what you need and what you want to understand, not what somebody else down the road that's doing the same work as you will do. So it's about, again, those doubt devils, about casting those aside and accepting what the plant is trying to teach you.
Yes, and I think that also that ties into something I really liked how you discussed the concept of no in the book.
Yes.
We're kind of already there. I mean, our culture tends to see we especially when we're new and we're excited about a thing, that like all things should be yes, and then there's also the way of turning it into, if I get a no, am I wrong, am I bad, is this my fault? Like it can turn into a lot of things that get
Yeah.
layered up outside of just well, what is your conception of that? How do we deal with that?
I think for me, in my practice, when I get a no, I feel it in my body. And I think I've talked to quite a few people and they get that same energetic feeling. And I always remember having a conversation with a lady once that wanted a wand from a cherry tree. She very much wanted this cherry tree because this cherry tree was growing in her father's garden and she wanted a relationship with it. And I understood it was a beautiful thought. And she said, oh, but she said, this cherry was not, it wasn't, it felt really odd when I was taking the wand. And I said, well, did you stop? And she said, oh, no, I take the wand. And she said, the problem is when I use the wand, it makes me feel sick. And I'm like, the whole point of working with the tree is that you work with the energy. So when you take a wand from a tree, you're not just holding a stick. You're holding a conscious communication with that living being that has allowed you to take a piece of itself so that you can use that energy in the working that you have. So it's about honoring that energy. And when the tree says no, and you will feel it, I feel it here, I feel it as a gut punch almost. And they don't mean to be nasty, but that's just how it feels. You must honor that. You must turn around and walk away. I don't know whether you read the bit about my experience with Blackthorn. This was, I wanted to do some work with, because round us, the ash trees are really, well, this was about 10 years ago, really struggling with the Hytophthora fungi. So I thought to myself, right, I'll do a spell, and it's the one that I use the Geomancy in the book, where I'll put Casa and bindweed around a piece of ash with a circle of salt, and I will use a blasting rod, which is made of blackthorn, to empower this barrier. Okay, so I go walking up the street, and in Wales, all of the trees are coppice, so they split and laid down to make a hedge. So I went to the first blackthorn, which I'd been talking to for a while, and I introduced myself and I said, please, could I have a piece of your wood to work this spell? And I had a very distinct no. Under no circumstances, no. You could feel it in your bones. So I said, oh, thank you. Okay, thank you very much. And I walked for probably about 2 miles, but it was the same hedge that was running. And when I got to the next blackthorn, I went to open my mouth, and the feeling I had in my body was, still me, you stupid girl. Because it was the same tree, because it'd been coppice. So eventually I got my blackthorn wand and I did the working, but it was a completely different tree in a field miles away from this hedge. But it's only when you experience that no that you'll end. It's almost like a calibration technique. You go and you say, can I have you? You feel the no, and then you'll know what that no feels like the next time you feel it. So it is difficult. And we as a culture, as a white Western culture, we very much want what we want. I want the thing, therefore I should be entitled to have the thing. But when you're working animistically, you have to understand that these guys are people too, and they can say no, and you have to honor that.
Yeah, absolutely. And that honoring of, but how do they put it? It's if you're talking only to hear yourself talk, then you're not actually interested in anyone answering you. So you actually have to believe that you're going to get an answer and then listen to the answer.
Yes, yeah. It's very much the what is it? Who said it? I can't remember who said it. The guy who wrote Matilda. Believing is seeing, not the other way around. It's really important that you believe these people are people, and then they will talk to you. If you one of the reasons I called my first book Unveiling the Green was because of the experience that I had with Mugwort. I went and I did a Mugwort initiation with a lady that was working with plant spirits. And before then, I'd said, oh, we haven't got any mugwort around here at all. It's, we live in Wales. It's boggy. We don't tend to get it. And the lady looked at me and she said to me, wait and see. So I had this lovely initiation into working with the spirit, and we smoked. I do the same ritual for other people now. We smoke mugwort, we drank it, we had tincture. It was lovely. There was a beautiful meditation. And then on the way home, I'm driving up my street, and there was mugwort everywhere. And I mean everywhere. It grew in every nook and cranny that you could find. And I'm driving along thinking, well, how haven't I seen this before? And I honestly believe that they have the capacity to veil. And then when you acknowledge them as people, suddenly they're there. It's something, when I'm teaching a class on this, it's something that I talk about, in that if you see a plant that is looking either particularly attractive, or maybe it's sort of got it's attracting your attention all the time, that is a plant that's saying to you, come and work with me. I've got something that you need. Because it's their way of waving, of getting your attention. So, yeah.
And I think that is something that I think these conversations are also important, because I've had conversations with people where when I will describe that, there'll be like a look that comes over someone's face and like, oh, well, that did happen to me. There was this one time with this one plant, and then they'll tell like a crazy story of something that is clearly not coincidence. And they will have dismissed it because it's not a conversation that is commonly had, but pretty much a lot of people have already had these types of experiences, but it hasn't, there's nowhere to situate it. And that's been kind of the problem. So, yes.
And that's the issue, is that because we are not taught in school, we're not taught in childhood, because this happens naturally in childhood. You know, I have memories of talking to the big oak that sat by the cow trench in the battlefield where I used to ride the pony. We naturally do that. We automatically allow ourselves to understand that there are other people in the world. Invisible friends and that sort of stuff. But then when you go to school, and in school, it's all mechanism. It's all mechanism. I'm an ex-biology teacher myself, and I can remember sitting in the classroom once, and I'm teaching biology, and I'm teaching the biology of colour. Okay, so it was supposed to be the biology of the eye, but I wanted to mess with their brains a little bit, because now and again kids need something to go, ooh. So I said, right, okay, so I held up a folder, and I'll do it like this. I held up a pen, and I said, what colour is that pen? So they all went, oh, it's pink, miss. And I said, no. I said, there's no such thing as pink. That is a material that is bouncing back white light, absorbing all the light except for the wavelength that corresponds to pink. That's bouncing back and hitting you in the eye, and your brain has labelled that as pink. And you could see them going, what do you mean there's no such thing as colour? I said, well, the other thing to think of is, you were saying that's pink. Everybody else will label that pink, but they might not be seeing the same pink as you see. Because, one of the things that people don't understand is that in some ways we live in completely separate universes. You know, in my universe, that's pink. In your universe, that might be pink. It doesn't mean that you're wrong. It's just that your eyes look at it in a different way. And it's exactly the same with magic. Just because something for you works magically, for somebody else it might not. I very often use the philosophical use of Marmite. Have you ever had Marmite? Some people love it, some people hate it, but it's the same chemical. So it's just in your universe it tastes wonderful, and in somebody else's universe it's horrible. So it's all about this self understanding, and understanding that not everybody will see it the same way as you do.
I just have to tell you that I actually remember torturing my own parents over the color example, because I was trying to get across to them that I said, but how can you be certain that we say? And they're like, no, we just know. Okay, can you stop asking why and making this more complicated?
I love it. But it's the same with anything else. I can remember literally people talking in the 1970s, 1980s, that it was okay to eat fish because fish don't feel pain. And my argument is, have you ever been a fish? How do you know that?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And that is where the arts of listening, and like you said, one of the hardest things is being still. And we're not good at that, and we're not encouraged to do that as a culture, because that is uh, not productive in the way that our culture likes us to think about product.
Absolutely, absolutely. It's one of the things I talk about in the book is it's perfect. You're allowed to be an individual. You're allowed to have any life you want, unless you want to have a life that doesn't involve yourself in the capitalist society, and then you're looked on with great big gouts of judgment.
Absolutely, absolutely. You mentioned the magic word of geomancy earlier, and in your book you go into and give some examples of how you incorporate geomancy into these workings. And you mentioned one. Geomancy is something we've had geomancers on the show here before, so I don't want to make you go into like a huge long explanation, but just in case somebody hasn't heard of that, can you do like super brief like intro to it before I have like one or two questions for you?
So, Geomancy is earth-based divination. Okay, it's a style of divination that started in the Arabic societies. It was originally called Ramal, and what you do, it's the simplest thing. You think about your question, you have a stick, and you make holes in the floor while you're thinking about your question, okay? And you do that 4 times. And you can either do complex geomancy, which is talking about mothers and daughters and cousins and nephews and judges and all sorts of stuff, or you can do quick and dirty, which is what we tend to do, which is you make one figure to answer the question, okay? So you make holes in the thing without looking at the holes and without thinking about it. You're just thinking about your questions. The first lot is you add them together, and if they make an even number, it's 2 dots. If you make an odd number, it's 1 dot. So you make 4 rows asking your question, and it makes a shape. And each of those shapes has got a different divinatory meaning. So, for example, Casa, which is what I used in the ritual with the ash tree, means it's almost like it's a Saturnian figure. It's an encasement, an imprisonment. And I wanted to encase that fungus to stop it spreading, okay? But each of them will have a different meaning. Things like Letitia will be joy, Tristia is sorrow, and you look at the shape that you get for the figure, and you can make a judgment on your divinatory process, okay? So we tend to use it differently. We will use the figures to empower a magical working, and one of the ones that I put in the book is by one of my covenants, who's called Lucy Greenwood. We wanted to do ecological work. We wanted a lot of the work that's done at the moment in the pagan field is done against things. So I know there's a famous spell at the moment against Donald Trump, and there's this, and we're going to curse. What was the curse in the moon? When made me go what? But but what we wanted to do is, instead of being against something, we wanted to make something grow. So we worked for the growth of green industries in the area that we are in South Wales, okay? So we went down to the garden on the beach, and Lucy is a Morris dancer, okay? So we used Morris dancing as a way to make energy. But what we did is, every time we did this Morris dance, we had a chorus where we all went together with our sticks in a circle, and we danced around. And then at the end of that, we would go into a geomantic figure. So we all stood in the different positions in the figure. And we did it, I think it was 3 weeks running, as the moon was waxing. And then we did it a last time on the full moon. That work, because when I wrote it up when we did the first edition with Black Lodge Publishing of Black Paths, and then I looked at the results of it in this edition that we just released with Eon Publishing, and the amount of growth of green industry in our area is huge. It's absolutely huge. We've had wind farms, we've had a hydrogen plant, we've had councils going from park and rides. So you park your car and then you ride on a free bus. There's been loads of that going on, but things like tree planting societies, all of this has sprung up in the 2 years since we did the work. So it was worked beautifully. And it's something I would encourage, rather than batting heads with the current status quo. Look at what you can grow instead. It's a much more useful way of working magic rather than trying to force somebody, because group mind that's a heavy thing. Once you've got a group mind involved, it's one of the things that we're all struggling with as pagans at the moment is the rise in fascism. That's a massive group mind. So it's better to work behind the scenes and encourage things like we're working with Dandelion at the moment to encourage things growing through the cracks, little things moving, and people being able to rebel but quietly, so they're not putting themselves in danger.
And that is another thing from nature, that the force of life is oftentimes the most powerful of all, and it can be underestimated by other people. So I am in complete agreement that, also nature abhors a vacuum. So it is much better to be putting new things in places and letting them expand.
Exactly.
So when we're talking about, clearly that is just such a beautiful example already. Are there other ways that you incorporate geomancy or working with those figures into specific relationships you have with different trees or plants? Do you find that there are certain ones that respond better, or that are like, oh yes, geomancy, I love, like any other kind of like symbiosis that you find?
Because they've got planetary alignments as well, the geomantic figures, you can use them in your meditations with the plant spirit. So for example, something like oak is Jupiterian, so you could use the Jupiterian figures to sort of visualize the figure in front of you, walk through it, and work with the plant on the astral plane. One of the things that Charabel, whose work I based the meditations in Black Paths on, did was he was one of the first people to look at working with plants on the astral plane rather than sitting with the plant. Now, I like both. I've got to be honest with you. I do like to sit with the plant as well. But he worked almost exclusively with the plant on the astral plane. And he did it by walking through the symbol. But you can use the geomancy for that as well. So, for example, if you were working with something like nettle and you wanted to work, you could use puer, which is a Martian symbol, and you could use that and go and visualize that growing in front of your face when you're doing meditations. Walk through the door that is puer, and you could sit with the spirit of the nettle that way as well. So they are very, very good meditational doorways.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely true. I just want to, we are, kind of coming towards the close of the interview, but I wanted to give people a taste, because in the book, you have a beautiful way of giving a number of different angles and facets to each tree that you bring up. And there's Culpepper, there's Charabel, there's your own personal gnosis. Is there any advice that you would give people when they are looking at, there's a lot of disparate advice out there, basically, about any given plant that you want to explore. How do you sort of handle the balance between historical or other people's opinions and what you do? Do you have like a process for how you work through that? Or
I found that the best way to do it is not to read anything at all until you've formed your relationship, because then that relationship is a natural one that comes from you. Okay. And then the biggest one for me that made me crease laughing is, I don't know whether you've read in Unveiling the Green, the piece I did on Buttercup, because that freaked me out, Summing Rotten, because I went into, buttercups are everywhere in Wales. They're absolutely everywhere. And I was thinking, before I went into the relationship, flower of the sun, it's going to be a lovely, easy thing to work with. It'll be a beautiful relationship. I can learn about growth. I can learn about photosynthesis. I can find out all these things from this wonderful plant. And when I went and sat in a field full of buttercups and I picked one, I suddenly realized that this is one of the most Martian plants I've ever made a relationship with at all. He was aggressive. He was in my face. It's not that he just didn't want to work with me. He really disliked anything besides his buttercuppery self, right? He was really like that. Well, I thought, well, I'm doing something wrong, because you do, So I went and I read Charabel, and Charabel said that buttercup is a plant that attracts psychopaths. So the one thing that I can be pleased of is that I'm quite obviously not a psychopath, because it really didn't like me. But what he said is that when you have someone with a massive aggression, the buttercup can absorb that aggression. That Martian aspect it has can take that from you. So then I read Culpeper, and he said almost identical things, that they were very good at working with people with what he called, what was the word he used that made me cringe? Demented states. That was the word he used, demented states. But you could feel it. You could absolutely feel it. So when now somebody, if I go somewhere and somebody says, "Oh, my favorite flower is a buttercup," I go, "Ooh." So yeah, you have to trust your own instinct, and the best way to do that is not to read anything on the plant. It's inevitable that you will get something through osmosis. Mugwort at the moment, she is everywhere, because I think she's opened herself up so much, because we need to start working with these plants to save ourselves and stop us from ruining everything. She's gone, right, I'm going to talk to everybody. And so you're getting experiences from Mugwort. But even there, when I worked with Mugwort, I was postmenopausal. So I worked with her. I got lots of stuff on dreaming. I got lots of stuff on opening doors. She was a massive door opener for me. One of my coven girls, Carrie, was in menstruation, and she's got endometriosis. And she was a complete blood plant for Carrie. She was all to do with cleaning the womb and getting her healthier in that way. So even if you know a little bit about the plant, you will get a different experience.
Yeah, no, that is also where the act of actually doing the thing, going out and meeting the plant is the best way. All the books and all the thinking in the world doesn't substitute for what you will then discover for yourself. So
exactly.
Before we wrap up, I like to always leave space for guests. It's kind of a last question, which is there anything in particular? I think you've touched on a lot of things that you are clearly very passionate about of people thinking with, but are there any conversations that you feel just keep coming up, or pieces of advice that you've heard yourself have to give a lot? Anything that you want to leave listeners with, as could be related to anything we've been talking about or something totally separate?
It's I think two things I think are pivotal at the moment, particularly in the place that we are with our exposure on TikTok, our exposure on social media. What the main one for me is that it's all very well and good to listen to people who are maybe more experienced than you, or maybe have a traditional training behind them. But at the end of the day, magic will come through you in whichever way is more natural to you. Just because you're doing it differently than your local Wiccan priest or your local witch or your local, doesn't mean it's wrong. It just means it's your way of doing it. And it's exactly the same with the plant spirits. Never ever listen to someone who tells you you're doing that wrong. Nobody should ever say to somebody you're doing that wrong. You can advise on technique, but if your technique is different to theirs, that's their technique. Leave them alone. So, and the other one is what we were talking about earlier on. Nobody understands everything. Nobody understands that some things we do are not as ecologically friendly as we would hope they would be. And the idea is that you get educated on it, you find out about these things. And when you find something that maybe A, is unecological, but B, is against perhaps your own moral compass, then you stop doing it. And one of the things I'm always trying to say to people is I'm not asking people to throw away their crystals. I'm asking them to keep them and honor them and develop relationships with them, because you can't send your amethyst home. You can't send your carnelian back to Buenos Aires, where it came from. But you can honor them and you can look after them. But just don't buy any more. If you know that these things are coming from ecological sources, and one of the things I found in my research, which God love, loads of people have said this to me, I only buy my crystals from ecologically friendly sources. There is no such thing as an ecologically friendly source of crystal. If you're walking on the beach and you find a beautiful white little piece of crystal, that's ecologically friendly. If you do that, when you finish your work, take the crystal home. Let it go back to where it should live, because it's a person. But there are no such things as amethysts that are ecologically mined. There are no such things as obsidians, which are ecologically mined. They are just not. It doesn't exist. It's a mythology that we've sold ourselves to make ourselves feel better about our practice. So it's about educating yourself in what is sound, admitting where you've made mistakes. I've still got crystals in my temple. I put them in the garden in the soil because that's the closest I can get to taking them home, you know. So I've got a big piece of amethyst and a big obsidian ball that I bought probably 30 years ago that sits in my rockery. So, but just take account of what you've learned and stop buying into that capitalist ideology that seems to be quite prevalent in paganism at the moment. Move away from it.
Yeah, yeah. And it's also about, knowing that you will learn more every day. So you're not going to reach a point where you're like, I won't make any more mistakes like that
No,
again.
no, you'll
Just
make loads. You'll make loads. But that's good. That's good, because if you think about it, if you couldn't make mistakes, if you couldn't do things the wrong way, we would be living in dogma.
yes, and that is not a pleasant place and not a healthy place either
No,
if it is causing
no,
issues for others around us, both human and non-human. So
exactly, exactly.
I appreciate your time very much. Tell us what I know you are probably working on many things, and you mentioned that you are going to be many places. Can you tell us a little bit about where you are going to be and what you're working on?
Oh, I am literally all over the place this year. I'm in a lot of camps. I'm in the Festival of Pagans and Witches on Sunday and Monday of this week. I am in Pagan Tribal Gathering. I'm doing a conference in Dorset for the Dorset Pagans. That's when I'm organising myself in October. I've got a book coming out at the end of June called Drinking Tea and Herding Spiders, which is a guide to running a magical group. And it's one of the things I'm proudest of is I've spent a lot of time discussing the safeguarding issues around working in a group, because I don't think it's something that people discuss. And I think it's very, very important for people who are beginners to be safe and to understand that there is nothing somebody can offer you that is worth allowing them to abuse you. And that includes financial abuse, that includes physical safety, safeguarding in the spiritual sense as well. So I've included all of that. And then I am sending the last book I've done, which I'm really proud of it, but it's driven me insane. it's a bit more of an academic book than my other books. I'm calling it The Slow and Fatal Dance, and it's a history of magical healing and healing in the world. So it's a big, long historical survey, really, of where we've come from. And then it's looking back at what the old different treatments were for things like fever and toothache. And I've looked through loads of grimoires and lots of different cunning man traditions. And that's coming out, I think it's going to come out in 2027. And then my last one, which is out in January, I've been writing since COVID, since I retired. I've written 5 books, and it's like, it seems to be, every time I send a new book out, I think, God, I've only just published the last one. But I've got a book from Moon Books coming out in January of 27 on Medusa and her role in working with victims of sexual trauma, and her history. So that's quite a good book. That's based on work that I do in workshop with victims of sexual abuse or sexual inappropriateness. So that's quite a good one. I'm quite proud of that one as well. So yeah, I am a busy bunny, and then I think I'm going to have a rest.
For a little bit. I don't know how much that'll last, but sure. Yes, I agree. I agree. Well, thank you so much for that. And I will have links to your books and other things. So if people are curious and where they can find you, that is in the show notes. And I will look forward to having you back on so we can talk about your next books. So thank you so much for your time so far.
Thank you. Thank you very much for having me. That's been great.
Don't you dare